Thyme is a culinary herb that's been used for thousands of years, not only for cooking, but also with many medicinal properties to it as well. This is a rather tedious herb that can be very easy to grow, but then at times, if you don't get it quite right, it can be quite painful. I, oddly enough, had a lot of trouble with it until quite recently, so I'm going to show you a few little tips that'll help you to actually propagate and grow your thyme properly. One of the first things to realise with thyme is it generally likes full sun, so give it a spot where it's going to get a lot of really nice sun, and that is one of the first steps in making sure that it is happy. Like many plants, it will grow in a shadier area, but that's not what it really wants to thrive. The tricky part with thyme, like many of the Mediterranean style herbs, is while it likes a lot of sun, it actually likes a reasonable amount of water, it also needs to be very well drained. So it doesn't like having wet feet. So you'll find it is quite prone to root rot. So this is the difficult balance that I personally found with thyme that gave me the greatest amount of difficulty to start with. One of the tricks that I found that seems to work quite nicely is hanging pots. If you use things like the coconut core ones, where it drains quite well, allows more air to the root system, and also still holds some moisture, but lets it drain really well, so you don't wind up with soaking, soggy, wet soil there. This allows it to get that well-watered, moist area without having wet feet. This here's an example of one of the plants I've got growing in a hanging pot, nicely well drained. This started off as a small plant that's basically spread out. It's very, very happy. So I water it reasonably regularly. One of the other benefits is you'll see it'll start to sort of wilt a bit as it gets too dry. If you don't leave it too long after that, give it a good watering when you see that happen, it does bounce back. So it can be quite forgiving as long as you do pay attention and don't let it dry out too much for too long. Now, like a lot of herbs, it has several different varieties. Multiple flavors and so forth. You get pizza thyme, standard garden thyme, different colored thyme, variegated thyme, lemon thyme, my personal favorite. It has a beautiful lemony smell along with the normal thyme as well. All in all, you can use all of them interchangeably, more or less, depending on the basic flavor profile that you're actually after. The care is essentially the same. Some of them creep more and are better as a ground cover. Some of them sort of grow taller, so depending on where you're putting it, can be a bit of variation there, and you've got different things you can work with. Now, if you're purchasing thyme from a nursery or some such, you'll wind up with something probably somewhere along those lines. Now, a couple of little tricks there as well. When you pull it out, you'll probably be able to split that up into a couple of different plants as well, so you'll want to let it grow for a while after doing that. But you can also, I'll use this as an example of how you should actually trim and prune this plant to actually get the best out of it as well. Now, a similar trick to what, if you will have watched my basil video, there's a very similar process to the pruning, propagating method that actually works best with thyme as well. And you'll find a lot of plants will be very similar in that regard. So I'll give you a look here. So this branch here is a very good example. So you can see it's nice and long, but you can also see other bits branching off. Now, in essence, when you're pruning it or chopping bits off to basically get the best out of the plant, you want to be cutting just above one of these nodes so it'll branch out, spread out, become a bit bushier. Also, then, if you're actually trying to propagate, ideally you want about 6 inches, 15 centimeters roughly in length. It will quite happily go from smaller, but you want to have your best chance. So you want to cut yourself a longer part, but it also prefers that woodier grain, where you see it's gotten a bit older. Now, the other trick there, when you're cutting it, it prefers the older parts for the regrowth. But not too old, obviously. It will quite happily grow from the new stuff as well. Just make sure you cut in the right spots and leave plenty of regrowth as well. Don't prune back any of your herbs too far, otherwise you'll give them too much of a system shock. But it is a relatively forgiving plant. The other trick is, if you get the stuff you buy from the store, and those nice long stretches that you can get, you can actually do them as well. Strip back the leaves, put them in water is generally the best way to go, because they're probably a little bit dry anyway. They need a bit of a drink. Now here's an example here of some very poorly looked after bits I put in the water, but here you can actually see it started to root. Now I personally prefer propagating straight in the soil, but needed to give an example of this, see how it actually roots. Now if I actually put that in the dirt now, there's a pretty solid chance that'll bounce back from the poor condition I've managed to get it in now. Now I also mentioned that it can grow back from a smaller piece. That was a bit I actually accidentally broke off quite some time ago and thought, oh, I'll just shove it in and see what happens. And I actually have myself a nice bushy little plant starting up from that. So just remember, the plant wants to live. If you give it enough that it can actually manage it, it'll do it. So there's a great example for you of just putting it in the dirt and growing back. Now I've got another example here. This is some that I basically pulled apart and spread around. But what you've got is it will actually grow and it'll start to root when it's really close to the ground. So the other way that you can actually propagate ahead of time is to, unintentional pun, is to get your longer pieces and just put a little dirt over them and wait for them to basically air propagate, so that it will actually start to throw down roots by itself, and then you can trim off from there. So while this plant isn't quite as a voracious grower as basil, with a small amount of this plant started and a little bit of patience, you can actually grow an unlimited amount of this without ever having to buy any more with just the one purchase, whether that be from scraps that you've gotten from the shops or buying a particular variety that you like. By pruning it in just the right way, you'll get yourself a nice bushy plant, and by getting your cuttings in the right spots and planting them and waiting and helping and encouraging it, you're going to get yourself a nice large plant that you'll be able to keep for years and years. It is a perennial. You don't have to plant it every year, so provided you don't kill the plant, you've got it for life. So a couple of final questions and tips when it comes to the plant. All right. It's like, oh, overwater, underwater, how careful do I need to be? Okay, this is a plant that is designed essentially for a Mediterranean environment, so not a lot of moisture. It prefers to get plenty of water hitting it, but not wet. If you are going to err on any direction, err towards too little water, it will let you know when it's not getting enough. Make sure it's got sufficient nutrients, otherwise basically it may still survive, but it's not actually going to thrive. And as I mentioned before, it will start to let you know if it doesn't have enough water. You'll get that drying out, wilting sort of look to it, and if you get to it quickly enough when that happens, it will bounce back by giving it a good watering. If you give it too much water, then the first time you are likely to really know about it is when it's too late, it's started to suffer from root rot, and you're going, what the hell's gone wrong? And it's just been too moist, it's too muddy, it hasn't got enough air left in there. It doesn't like soggy. So the other way to go about it, if you're a regular waterer, is put something like perlite or more sand in there to make sure that it drains out and doesn't hold the moisture too much. You want it to have a really well draining soil, even more so if you do give it regular watering. So just a couple of final thoughts here. From the original pot that I showed you earlier, as you can see, the plant itself, it's not a particularly deep rooter. So if you're putting it into a pot, a shallower pot is generally a pretty good idea. That will also help with not overwatering and not getting a muddy sludge in there. The other thing as well is if you wish, you can actually separate that out into multiple plants and it will come back from that. For me personally, in this scenario, I'm just going to keep it as the one plant, but you can actually do it. And that's another way to help yourself grow out more. A little bit more patience involved though. So there you have the basics of how to look after your thyme, how to tell when it hasn't had enough water, and a few tips on how to look after it and make sure it doesn't get too much water. Also pruning and propagating and getting the best out of your plants, and hopefully this has been useful for you and you get something useful out of it. If you find this useful, please subscribe, and if you haven't checked out my basil video yet, check that one out. I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.